So I'm going to talk about our book that is recently launched called Ayahuasca Shamanism in the Amazon and Beyond. I've been involved in the production of 12 books, and I can't really say this is my favorite because it would be like a mother saying that prefers one child over the other. But I really think this is one of the best books ever that I've been involved with. And yeah, modestly speaking, in this whole field, I think it's really, like my friend Alex said, a deal breaker. It's bringing a lot of good new information, and I want to talk about it. Just start remarking that the title, Ayahuasca Shamanism in the Amazon and Beyond, there is a play of words there. So it's beyond the Amazon, and it's beyond. It's the invisible world. It's about another dimension, about communicating with the ancestral spirits. And I think that what brings a lot of people here is this magic of ayahuasca that has touched so many of us. The cover is done by my co-editor, Clancy Kavanagh. So she did it specially for this book. It's the snake shaman. As we know, the ayahuasca is told to be sent by very different indigenous groups as a beverage that was from the snakes, that was given to us, to human beings. So we received this from the snakes. So the books, it has 11 chapters, a foreword and an introduction. And I'm going to try to convey here some of the main ideas of the book. It's a challenge because it's an essay of a collection. And so it's not a single authored book, but I think that it's a really organic book. It's really a whole. It's really, the parts are talking to each other. They really make a dialogue and complement each other. So I tried to squeeze here what are the main ideas that are present in this book, which I think is its benefit. It's not as one of the blurbs in the back say, it's not just another instance of mystical mumbo-jumbo about ayahuasca, because I think that together with ayahuasca, there has been so much superficial and kind of messianic apologetic writings about ayahuasca, and we try to do it really, keep the magic of it, but also do some critical thinking. So I'm going to convey some of the main ideas, and just want to tell a kind of weird anecdote that we had asked this guy, Stevens Rubinstein, to write the foreword of the book, and he was writing the foreword, and he was found dead with the foreword in his computer. So he died while writing the foreword of our book. So we dedicated the book to him. And I just want to acknowledge that was a great loss for all of us, and irony on that. So, talking some of the main idea of the books, the book covers mainly Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. So, perhaps what's missing there is Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela. Those are the spots that Ecuador is more developed, but Bolivia and Venezuela are less developed, this whole ayahuasca expansion trend. But Ecuador is definitely an important lack. So I met this computer guy recently that told me that people can absorb only one information in a PowerPoint. So I'm experimenting this new method with one information on the slide. What I put there is the title of the first. I have around 7 topics that I want to address. Deconstruct a notion of a linear narrative about ayahuasca. So people tend normally to make this evolutionistic narrative about the origins of ayahuasca. So there were indigenous shamans that used ayahuasca deep in the forest, and then they were passed on to mestizo people, riverine people, and these people passed on to white or non-indigenous people, and it developed in big cities, and then you have the ayahuasca churches, you have the New Age movement, and it expanded and globalized around the world. This is a kind of, let's say, standard narrative on how ayahuasca came to be what it is today. But the book is deconstructing strongly this idea. The book, chapters show that this process has been much less uniform and homogeneous and linear than that. It has had many backs and forths. So in many senses, the expansion of ayahuasca is from the forest to the city and from the city back to the forest. In other words, there is a kind of continue between forest and city. For example, so this is like a big menu of, you're gonna get a little appetizer of all the topics. I'm not gonna go deep in any of that, but I hope that you can buy the book and read it. To give some examples of what we're talking about, for example, the opening chapter by Glenn Shefford reflects on the recent introduction of psychotra leaves, which is one of the most common ingredients of the ayahuasca brew, to the Machigenga people. And the adoption of ayahuasca by the Yora in the Manu River just as recently as the 80s. So a lot of tribes that we look that have contemporary use of ayahuasca, and we take for granted that they have been using this since ever and ever. If you look more carefully into it, then you actually see that the adoption of ayahuasca by the subjects is quite recent and frequently mediated either by other indigenous groups or by missionaries or even politicians or non-local people. This has been said a little bit before, and I think in the panel, that another author, for example, Bernd Brabeck de Morat, he echoes the ideas of Shefford, and he suggests that the introduction of ayahuasca among the Shipibo people is much more recent than one would imagine, which is quite ironic if you think that the Shipibo have become this kind of big international symbol of the guardians of ayahuasca, of the traditional holders of ayahuasca lineage. But the Shipibo people maybe use ayahuasca as long as 300 years, and we're not even sure about that. Another good example is a chapter by Stergin Langdon and Isabel de Rose, that they make an ethnography of the arrival of ayahuasca to the Guarani people in the southern Brazil. So you have the Amazon in the north, and then in the south of Brazil, very far away, it's a very big country, you have a Guarani people who learned about ayahuasca through a New Age network group called the Sacred Fire of Iztachilatlan that made this alliance. So the Guarani Indians, the Santo Daime Church, and this group of kind of like a North American, more hybrid transnational branch that uses peyote. There was this big gathering that brought ayahuasca to the Guarani people, and then the Guarani people started to use ayahuasca in their rituals and gave a Guarani name to the brew of ayahuasca and narrate that they have been using ayahuasca since the beginning of times, and have already a myth telling the story on how ayahuasca came about. So to deconstruct this linear narrative about ayahuasca, perhaps we should not say deconstruct this linear narrative, but rather, on the words of Oscar Calavia Saez, who writes the foreword, not to deconstruct an ancient tradition of ayahuasca, but to tell the story of its construction. He also notes, and this is a quote, "It is not the Indians, but rather the recently created ayahuasca churches, which like to spread the idea that their practices are descent from the Inca and from the beginnings of time. The backwoods Indians, on the other hand, prefer to compare ayahuasca with televisions or the movies, or who knows, even the internet." So this idea that ayahuasca is something old since the beginning of times is something that is much more present among us than in traditional settings. The second point was to, along these lines, to deconstruct the idea of authenticity. So this is another big motive of the book, and I think of many forums like this where ayahuasca is debated. Perhaps the better question is not whether ayahuasca is authentic or not. That's not perhaps the better question we have to ask. But the better question is, why is there this need for authenticity? So Amazonia is historical. It is not indistinguishable from its natural environment. This whole idea that indigenous cultures don't change since the beginning of times and they have been there forever, it's much an outside idea because Amazonia is historical. And here I'm giving another quote from the foreword. If, despite all this deconstruction, we decide to stick with the notion of authenticity, it could be of benefit, after all, given the contemporary state of meteoric trends and fashions. At the very least, we should purify it of any archaic residue. The authenticity of ayahuasca asserts itself, on the contrary, by its very modernity. So this is a part of what I said in the beginning, that this book is trying to think critically of this phenomenon of ayahuasca and get out of common sense ideas about what ayahuasca is. Related to this idea of questioning authenticity is another point that ayahuasca is in fact a hybrid invention. So this is part of a contemporary trend of anthropology to say that there is no cultural essence. There is no essence to culture. Culture is not something about an essence that has been there and it's permanent and fixed since the beginning of times. Chapter shows that shamanism is less about a fixed content and more a way of determining the relationship between levels and codes. So the many different contributions of the book are arguing that you do not have this fixed whole, this essence that is passed by one groups of another, but rather there is a kind of shamanic logic or shamanic way of thinking that is transmitted. So it's less about this fixed essence or content, but more about how you establish relationship about levels and codes. The other point is to think, why is ayahuasca efficient? Why is it so appealing? Why are we all here? Why is it become so trendy? And why is there so much documentary and internet and conferences and about all this contemporary interest in ayahuasca? What are the anthropological answers to this very pertinent question? So this could be answered in many levels, and as I say, this is just a general introduction. On the one side, it incarnates some kind of indigenous identity. Ayahuasca became a symbol of what it is to be Indian for outsiders, or perhaps, better saying, a kind of pan-indigenous identity, an identity of many indigenous groups. Francoise Barbara Friedman argues that indigeneity seems to be the central currency of exchange in the Iquitos Nahuatl Road, inhabited by, quote, indigenous, covered indigenous, mestizo, and gringo shamans. So it's this association between ayahuasca and indigeneity. This is not happening only in Peru, but also in Colombia. There is one chapter by Aliena Caicedo that addresses this, and she makes also analogous remarks. In an environment of great shamanic experimentation that also encompasses, besides yagé, which is the Colombian name of ayahuasca, the use of yopo, coca, and tobacco, yagé remains connected to the image of the indigenous that predominate in national society. Non-indigenous Colombians and a few foreigners established their identity and legitimacy by being associated with a recognized Taita, or an ayahuasca elder, in the Putumayo-Caquetá region. And Mesturini and Lozonsky, in another paper that is not exactly on this book, but I think that relates to this, claim that ayahuasca's popularity is associated with a double connection, with the Amazon, with its wild nature, the spiritual and ecological reserve of the world, and to the Amerindian. So on the one side, this pure, wild, untouched portion of nature, of the world, the Amazon, and on the other side, the Amerindian, who represents the guardians of a primordial wisdom and the incarnation of an ecological ideal. This idea that shamans are ecological, in essence. This is all recent, and it's a cultural construction, and that's how we're trying to look at the rays of this phenomenon. In one word, or in one phrase, ayahuasca manages to condense these images, both the Amazon and the Amerindian, and convert them into a consumable substance. So by drinking ayahuasca, you would be touched both by the powers of the wild forest and the powers of the Amerindian primitives. And then, so this is all under this big question, why is ayahuasca efficient? The first point I mentioned has to do with this idea of indigeneity and perhaps associated to the Amazon. Then the second part of this, of why is ayahuasca efficient, why is our eyes shining, and why is everybody looking at me, and why is everybody here? And this is, I think that this is a way, I created a little bit of all of this based on my own ideas in the chapters of the book. It's what I called, ayahuasca is a means of communication, of establishing relationships. This might sound a little bit obvious or even silly, but taking it seriously, it's very, I think, deep, very profound. So establishing relationships between what? Among subjects, among worlds, and among symbol systems. And I'm reading here another quote, again from the foreword. Ayahuasca used by forest peoples is mostly about sociality, a negotiation among human and non-human companions and neighbors, an activity that established networks, sometimes precarious, between kins and affins, masters and apprentices, brothers-in-law, animal spirits, and the dead, or a battleground between rival shamans to connect with potential allies who are also probable enemies. This has to do also with something we discussed in the panel about this doubleness of relationships, because, for example, a war relationship is also a means of communication. It's also a relationship. So when we say relationships, it's not all about being harmonic and happy, one big family. It's about this tension, but it's a way of processing tensions and relationships, both with kin, affinity, and with enemies, or with the dead, or the ambiguity of these relationships. In other words, another good phrase, ayahuasca is a privileged means of establishing ties with all categories of others. Others with a capital O here, with difference, with alterity. So there's one other good chapter, which is one of my favorites. My friend also, Bernd Brabeck-de-Marat, he's an ethnomusicologist who married a Shipibo woman and has 5 Shipibo Austrian kids, and they live in Austria. And he lives in the basement studying music and just is a very knowledgeable person. And he kind of thinks it's a whole crap, this expansion, and he's very critical to it, and he just doesn't tolerate very much of, people using Shipibo names and claiming to be the lineage of whatever shaman. And I said, but man, it's happening, let's try to, be generous also, try to understand, and kind of convince him to write a paper for the book and edit it out to, let's say, cut a little bit of the aggressivity of his opposition, but also incorporate his criticism. And he came out with a great paper that tells the story of the expansion, trying to understand it from the Shipibo point of view. How do the Shipibo see people like us drinking ayahuasca? Bernd Brabeck-de-Marat, dialoguing with the literature on Amerindian perspectivism, attempts to provide an insider view on how the Shipibo interpret the foreigners who approach them for ayahuasca ceremonies. He explores how contemporary Western-oriented ayahuasca rituals might fit into Shipibo cosmology, which plays an important role in defining their positionality in the cosmos and in the globalized world. He tells the story of how Shipibo people laugh at the gringos, which are called in Shipibo rinco, who suffer from uncontrollable effects of ayahuasca or having strange behavior during sessions. Due to the high importance of joking in Shipibo discourse, making fun of somebody is actually a powerful tool for dealing with authority, for incorporating the other, for one's own transformation into the other while maintaining a superior position. I find this very, very cool, very fascinating, thinking of how the Shipibo, one way to manage this shock of diversity is to make fun of us. But making fun is also a way of dialoguing. It's also a way of incorporating that other into one's own categories, but perhaps in a hierarchical manner. Then there is the other point. Ayahuasca has an ability to facilitate interchange and exchange between different ethnicities. So this is a little bit related to what I said before about the powers of establishing communication and being a mediator of authority. Here is a kind of more specific claim, is that ayahuasca has been historically very powerful in making connections between different ethnic groups. The use of ayahuasca helped build ethnic alliances and political strategies among indigenous groups. It makes help build pan-indigenous alliance, both between Indians and actually with outsiders. For example, through the use of ayahuasca, indigenous group can establish connections with transnational NGOs or churches like the Santo Daime or New Age therapists and so forth. There's one chapter by this very also interesting author, Pirjo Virtanen. She's from Finland. I just have a lot of admiration for all these colleagues that go to these other places of the world, learn the language, and go do field work. And she's another example. So she went to Rio Branco and she was studying, like in Rio Branco there is an institution that promotes bilingual education. So teach the Indians how to speak Portuguese, how to do math, how to learn some basic things about our world so that they can, survive. And so this is like a kind of school. It's a very, very nice spot. I've been there. That you have from anthropologists, collecting myths to young students trying to learn, and all kinds of pilgrims going and passing through. And in the nights, they hold some ayahuasca sessions. And then different, off the school, this is like a side activity, so different ethnicities come and sit and drink ayahuasca together. So this is like semi-rural, urban part of Rio Branco in the north, the capital of the state of Acre in the Amazon. And by sitting together in ceremony, these different Indians tell their stories and share their myths and share their experiences, what it is to be an Indian in the world nowadays. And through this exchange, they kind of affirm their ethnic identity. But which is an ethnic identity in construction, which is also dynamic, and which is also departing from this mediation of a non-indigenous context. And I think this is another great example of all the arguments of this book, which I think go against this kind of common sense, simplistic narrative, which I mentioned in the beginning, from the forest to the city. It's more complicated than that. It's more dynamic, and that's why it's so interesting, and that's why it's so pervasive, and that's why it's so powerful for all of us. So the key words in this discussion is the idea of networks, or of circuits, of mobility. Then there is another related topic that is called Ayahuasca New Ethnic Emergencies. So what are ethnic emergencies? This is a very complicated anthropological discussion as well. There are several examples of how ayahuasca has influenced the process of ethnic revivals, or emergence or re-emergence of indigenous identities. So on the one side, there is the case of the Guaranis that I mentioned in the beginning, which is indigenous people that did not use ayahuasca and started using now, after the 2000s in the south of Brazil. This is one case. But there is also another case, which is reinventing authenticity. Reinventing authenticity is instrumental to a process named cultural revival, or indigenous traditions and new ethnic identities. So there is one chapter, for example, by Mariana Pantoja. This is very interesting because I published a paper from her in my first book in 2002, where she narrates the use of ayahuasca between rubber tappers and the family that was known to be as os Mutants, the Mutants. And so they were like rubber tappers living in this reserve in the upper Amazon that claimed to have rights over the land like indigenous groups should have. They actually managed to make the first non-indigenous rubber tapper reserve. And they were the leaders of an association that run this reserve, this extractivist reserve, a very, very progressive model of managing the land and environmental worries and integrating the people who lived in the space. And then there was a process that they kind of lost their leadership in running the association, and many other things happened. The fact is that one of the grandmothers of the Mutant, she was a Kuntanawa Indian. So the Kuntanawas, they were extirpated in what was known the correrias, which was the process that the white people went to the rubber tapper camps and just killed all the Indians or abducted the children and basically wiped out. And they had a process of kind of rescuing their identity as Kuntanawa based on this one relative that existed. So they started to drink ayahuasca and have visions about their Kuntanawa past and built their Kuntanawa identity in an alliance with other local groups, like many Pano-speaking groups. So they started to invite shamans of other groups to drink ayahuasca with them, and then start to wear feathers and to receive indigenous songs. So they started to revitalize this aspect of their culture. So in my 2002 book, it's a chapter about the Mutants, and in my 2014 book, it's a chapter about the Kuntanawa people. And of course, this is controversial because for outsiders, or let's say a regular local person might say, oh, that's all charlatans. They just want to get land or privileges, so they claim they are indigenous. So that's really fake. They are not really indigenous at all. And this is just a whole strategy to get land or to get power. And these discussions are very complicated because if one starts this process of looking for roots, then we have a lot of what is indigenous after all. And ayahuasca seems to play an important role in this reinvented tradition. So there is also this local festival, the Pano Festival that is held in Acre. There's a very strong revitalization moment of indigenous groups in Brazil. So they have this festival where people from all over Brazil and from all over different Pano traditions from the Amazon, and they make like a 4 or 5 day feast, which is a big party, and in many ways politically incorrect, making like jokes that are malicious or that white people would get embarrassed. And they're just making these big, strong parties and celebrations and festivals which incorporate Western representations about what it is to be indigenous. So they manipulate this idea of culture politically in this dialogue with the other. And ayahuasca is a big element in this whole attraction and in this negotiation. So this whole idea that anthropologists call the objectification of culture is to creating the idea that we're going to present our culture. So there is this expectation that we get to know indigenous culture, and they sort of represent their culture and show it to outsiders. So ayahuasca has played an important role in this process. And then the next point is there is perhaps a double or simultaneous process. On the one side, there is a trend of reinvention, transformation, modernization. But on the other side, and together with that, there is a process of shamanization or retraditionalization or indigenization. So I think that this whole book is interesting, and I recommend its reading exactly because it's dealing with this complexity of things happening simultaneously. So on the one side, we can't deny all these changes and modifications, but on the other side, there is this trend to rescue or to clean Christian influences and go back to indigenous roots. One example of this is, for example, the fact that a lot of mestizo or gringos shipibize themselves, this idea that you represent yourself as an indigenous, or a whole purification of Christianity. A lot of healers that, for example, start to change the words of Icaro, and instead of saying virgin, virgencita, they will say warmi, the woman. So kind of try to pull out what is Christianity out of it. Or things, when we say retraditionalization or re-shamanization, is perhaps making the realm of the expansion of ayahuasca has made a process of shamanization of things that were traditionally not so shamanic. For example, the process of cooking ayahuasca, which in many ways it's not a ritual process. It's kind of like cooking things. You can have a woman watching TV, the kids running around, the chicken in the background, and they're cooking ayahuasca, and then there's this trend of ritualizing the preparation of ayahuasca, or just the ritualization of an ayahuasca indigenous space. The whole idea of malocas, which is this space where you drink ayahuasca, Francoise Barbara Friedman shows how this is a recent arrival, because the idea of a maloca is like a white person's representation of an indigenous space. So they built big malocas, and this becomes sort of the symbol of this traditional ayahuasca space, whereas traditionally ayahuasca is drunk more in the house of somebody or in a clearing in the forest, and so forth. Then the next point is that the book does not avoid dealing with conflicts. So if we want to talk about expansion, we can't run away from this sort of topic. And among these problems, what are many challenges involved in the ayahuasca expansion? For example, the fact that ayahuasca is being pushed to the underground, its regulation, legality issues are also touched upon. And another hot, very literally, topic, which is the idea of sex abuse, ayahuasca and sex-related problems. So there is a very, very interesting paper by my dear friend and colleague Daniela Peluso, who analyzed gender relationships, sex and seduction between shamans and local and no-local women who participate in ceremonies with them. Engaging with critical feminism, she reflects upon the role of male gaze in tourist settings, especially in those that represent greater economic inequalities. If the meeting of unfamiliar culture brings up issues of exploitation, misunderstanding, and mistrust, this chapter shows that these are more complicated matters than they first appear, since of these conflicts are historically imbibed in shamanism. So she explores a lot on how gender relationships happen traditionally, and also deconstructs some of our ideas, such as cultural misunderstanding, and speculates how much of that has to do with gender relationships among shamanism traditionally. So in sum, the book has a view that is both tolerant, and I think this is very important, tolerant towards expansion, because a lot of anthropology colleagues are pretty orthodox and critical about the whole expansion, accommodating diversity and plurality, but also addresses tensions such as legality, ethics, gender imbalance, orthodoxy, health-related risks, asymmetric relationships between the North and South, different views on environment, concepts of health and disease, and the training and credibility of healers. So I would say that the book presents a balanced view, not entirely critical, but also not lenient. And then in the end, there is a big question: ayahuasca and colonization. What can we think about that, looking on the light of today's expansion of ayahuasca? So there's a bunch of diverging views. Is this ayahuasca expansion the colonization of the West by indigenous peoples? Are the indigenous peoples colonizing us? Is this a reverse kind of colonization? Or is this a new diaspora? Is this a means of self-esteem, cultural pride, and indigenous revitalization? Or is this the contrary? It's about colonizing and another form of cultural cannibalism, that after we have conquered indigenous cultures in so many aspects, we're now colonizing their spirituality, which would be like the last domain that was still reserved to indigenous people. And here I'm going to say another quote from the Oscar. Indigenous people do not limit their use of ayahuasca to relations with animal spirits and mastery of game animals. These are, of course, important, but today, as always, Amazonian peoples interact with many other powerful agents. Ayahuasca would be little more than a folkloric simulacrum if it did not operate on contemporary context. Ayahuasca is now the motor of a missionary enterprise that indigenous Amazonians have directed towards the same societies that bombarded them with their own missionaries for centuries. Has the dialogue become finally symmetric? Or after all, this is about our consumerism of indigenous spiritualities? Is this about vulgarization, banalization, folklorization, commodification of indigenous cultures? I don't think there is one single answer for that, but I believe that critical thinking is the only way out of this dilemma, of this puzzle. And I'm going to read a final quote for you. This volume will be useful to anyone who wishes to understand the current trends of globalization of ayahuasca rituals, as well as the contextualized transformations of shamanism in the Amazonian that parallel, yet differ from, recent developments in Central Asia. Fueled by contradictions and historic continuities and discontinuities, ayahuasca shamanism has come to stay. This expansion cannot be reduced to some sort of Western cultural cannibalism or obsession with the substance effect. The versatile appropriation and use of ayahuasca by relatively isolated indigenous groups in Amazonian and by new indigenous shamans are reinventing rituals in a pan-Amerindian cultural context outside Amazonia, points to its complex associations with indigeneity. While the former favor ayahuasca as a cultural medium of exchange with downriver mixed populations that have access to urban-based power, the later integrate the brew in their rituals as a portal of power for tapping into deeper sources of indigeneity. In contrast, ayahuasca is a hallmark of syncretism in the new religious movements that have arisen around its use in Brazilian Amazonia. Whether it is a hunter's tool, a sorcerer's weapon, a doctor's medicine, or a daimista's Eucharist, ayahuasca's mysterious qualities seem to ennoble those who have mastered its power. Wherever it is introduced, the brew appears to elicit engagement with tradition and innovation, and with self and authority, in ways that soon make it predominant in the context into which it's incorporated. Whether gringos opt for going native in Amazonia or choose to do ayahuasca with their own Celtic, Wiccan, Native North American, or Eastern references, they are present in the transformational space of ayahuasca. At the same time, Amazonian indigenous and mestizos people make use of ayahuasca shamanism in novel forms to uphold reinvented traditions and emergent social identities, or to promote new ethnic and political alliances. As ever in the history of Amazonia, cultural transformation is dialogical, downstream and upriver, across towns and forests, inseparable from the cosmopolitan cultural trends enacted in the international political economy. Thank you.
I guess one thing that you were already pointing towards towards the end of your talk was it's a rapidly changing landscape. Do you think that you might be able to write, or that the second edition of this book might be written in 5 or 10 years' time? Or do you think the landscape is changing so much that it'll have to be a completely different work?
What I want to suggest is something that Alex Gearing is doing here, is some ethnographies about Australia. I think that this is an awesome topic, and the fact that ayahuasca is brewed in Australia, and it grows locally, and what does this mean in terms of the culture that is, appearing around it? I think that could generate a very interesting book. And for sure, a second edition would need to incorporate something like that.
I suspect that might be written one day before too long. Question from the floor.
Hi, Bea, that was fascinating, thank you. I wanted to ask in particular about the first couple of points of deconstructing the linear story and deconstructing authenticity, and just if you are able to say anything about a more realistic way to think of the history of ayahuasca as a technology and a tradition, and how it has developed in the Amazon area.
Well, this is a very, very large question. Like, you have different traditions and different ways of using ayahuasca. So I think that one big point is that ayahuasca is not always related to healing. There's this modality that we know as vegetalism, which is like the shaman that gives ayahuasca to people and diagnoses and treats them. But perhaps a more old, ancient use of ayahuasca is related both to the ideas of hunting and to warfare. So there's another paper of Oscar, who wrote the foreword in our book. This book, he wrote a chapter in our Internationalization of Ayahuasca book, that he's arguing exactly on how ayahuasca traditionally work as this kind of negative diplomacy. So you drink ayahuasca and you see that a rival group is going to kill you, is preparing an attack. So you go there and you attack their group first and kill everybody. And that's related to drinking ayahuasca. So it always gives me a kind of creep when people start to talk about these harmonic ideas about ayahuasca, because traditionally it's not like that. It's much more, it has a lot to do with tensions and disputes and rivalries and a means of negotiating war. And I think that this is a part of the story that is not very told in the New Age circles. But there's many different traditions, there's many different ways, and it's a big question.
This actually follows on from what you were just talking about. I carried out field work in Peru last year in an ayahuasca centre, and found consistently that people were going into this alternative culture where there was an incorporation of darkness and light, there was an incorporation of healing and harm, that sort of a whole story was told within this culture. Inevitably they came away though speaking in terms of more Eastern philosophy and New Age philosophy and complementary medicine kind of ideals, where things were generally light and fabulous and good and bright. And I just wondered, in your opinion, whether you think that maybe we're doing damage or creating harm by only bringing away one aspect of a story and changing the culture that way, because that's the story that people at home are hearing, is just one side of the culture that's been experienced, and that's what's being propagated. Or whether maybe by creating a more global culture that's more attractive, it's a good thing because it's opening the medicine up to more people. So I'm just wondering what your idea is around that.
It's always hard to get into the merits, and it's a kind of comfortable position to be an outsider, like anthropologist narrating and not really getting into the merits of things. So I don't feel in a way that it's my job to judge or analyze. I think that our job as anthropologists is to show these complexities. And I think that if people learned more about this sort of thing, there would be less reductionism. And that would be a way to honor better these traditions. And I hope that the books and lectures and things that I do and my colleagues do, it's another drop in the bucket in that direction. And the other thing I want to say is that there is a cool argument also in a chapter by Lozonsky and Mesturini, that they say that a lot of the success of the ayahuasca expansion or trend, whatever, is a cultural misunderstanding. They are drawing on some very sophisticated research that is studying like the communication of mammals, for example, dolphins and stuff. So communications, by studying this form of language, signs and stops and silence and continuity, they're sort of like making a kind of extension and comparison to rituals. So what they're claiming is that a lot of the fact that it works is that people really don't understand each other. So the Indians are talking about spirits and are talking about metamorphosis and incorporation of plant animals, and the people outside are talking about the inner self and the subjectivity and my inner jaguar or my primitive side. And one, oh, okay, jaguar, oh, okay, jaguar. Like, they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're not really talking about the same thing. And I think that this misunderstanding is what really makes a lot of relationships possible, even if you think like a marriage. If people understood what the other one is saying the whole time, it would get very tiring. So there is this, arena of non-understanding that allows this communication. And so it's a kind of a delicate balance, because I think that how much of the efficiency of the ritual derives from the fact that people don't understand what's being sung. And this is funny for me as a Brazilian too, because you get these Americans, and you can't say in this like politically correct, these northerners or whatever, like singing Santo Daime rituals and songs, and I ask them, but do you understand what you're singing? And I think that the fact that they don't fully understand the lyrics, like this alterity, also helps them enjoy. So I think these people that go there and translate it into terms of complementary medicine and psychological work, that's part of the success of why it works, and it works for them, and it does work for them.
Is it possible also that on a pragmatic level, people have an investment on a number of levels in going for healing? So they're more likely to come back feeling healed. It's a sort of an aspect of placebo effect, that despite the fact that there are positive and negative aspects to the experiences while they were in the space, they come back to their own environment, their own context, and they're more likely to see the positive side of things because they went there with the intention for positive results.
Yeah, I think definitely suggestionability works, and you have to sort of believe in what you're doing for it to work. It's like that classic article of Levi-Strauss. It's the belief of the person in herself, the belief of the community in her. So I think there's that. And then I just want to say that besides that, I also think there's a magic of ayahuasca. And there's also something happening that we don't fully understand. So I don't think that it's just about believing. I think that it really, these rituals are able to activate some. I wouldn't be like a culturalist that everything is reduced to the powers of culture. I think that there are other forces that are at play too. It's just not something that I feel I know a lot about to lecture, and it's not my job, but I think that, there's other things that also count, that are beyond our books.
Thank you, Bea, for the presentation. I would like you to explain a bit more about the connection between ayahuasca and ecology, because you mentioned that people always relate shamans to somebody who is ecological concerned. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because Dennis McKenna has been recently in Australia. I've listened to him talk, and he quotes an experience that he had, and a call that he had in regards to the world, the way it is. And we are living an environmental crisis, really. So I would like you to, if you can deepen this idea between this connection that is made between ayahuasca and ecology. Thank you.
Well, it's like rubber tappers, they're not ecological. They're doing their thing. This whole idea of ecology is our construction about what these practices are. And you can trace the rise of this phenomenon historically, and perhaps a good landmark for this discussion is the appearance of the people of the forest movement, Povos da Floresta. So that was in the times of Chico Mendes, that famous rubber tapper who was murdered doing political activism in the Amazon. And this created a whole alliance of different groups that did not dialogue before, which was like indigenous people, riverine people, and all kinds of different professions, people who collect cashews and different forms of activities, together with ecological activists. And in Brazil, this created a very strong, powerful alliance where it was a cultural construction in the sense that what these indigenous people are doing or what the rubber tappers are doing is their thing. And we created this narrative that they are ecological people and that they are sustainable. And there was this sort of blend and alliance. And then this appears to us naturalized. And this is as an obvious connection. But this connection didn't exist before. There's a history to this connection. And so you can study those ways. And I think this is one of the most powerful paradigms, is to say that shamans are these big ecological guardians. And it could be questioned in several levels, like the ideas that we have of ecology don't match necessarily indigenous values. To give a very simple example, well, I invited my Kaxinawa friend to give a lecture about ayahuasca, about the Kaxinawa, and somebody made a question, and then he said, well, we're walking, and then we killed that monkey, and somebody was very shocked in the audience. What do you mean, kill the monkey? Like, that's murder, like some animal activist. And he's like, no, well, kill the monkey, of course, kill the monkey. We killed the monkey, and things like that. Or just this idea, like, the whole relationship to nature in indigenous cosmologies is highly ambiguous and tense. And I think I like a lot that movie about the man who wanted to live with the bears, and he was an ecologist who ended up being eaten by a bear. And they interviewed this Inuit guy, Eskimo guy, and he's like, he didn't get it. He's trying to be friends to the bear. They're another thing. So there's many tensions of these ecological ideas of vegetarianism. I'm going to talk about vegetarianism to indigenous people. That's very laughable. And I think that, that's where you can sense those ideas of tensions. Or you're going to capture a snake, talk to the snake, and then release the snake. No, you kill the snake. So I think, there's many ways you could see this. But on other ways, if you're trying to construct a counter-narrative to industrialization and to consumerism and to this industrialized, capitalistic society, and then I think you can look to those indigenous groups, but selectively. What about their ideas of gender? There's many tensions and contradictions that I think that the New Age movement flatten it out. On the other side, how good that this movement is doing this, because without this, it would be even worse, and we would have even less references of these other cultures. So I'm not a purist or an orthodox that think that, only anthropology discourse is valid. But I do think that we have to claim a space for anthropology in the whole discussion, and that's the point of the book.
Okay, well, I just wanted for us to maybe finish on a short discussion on brujeria. And, we're talking about the cultural spread of ayahuasca, and really, it's healthy for us to have an understanding of its past and not be pulled into a narrative that might not be true. But is it also, possible for it to be healthy for an emerging culture in Australia, for example, to be discerning about which elements we want to take on and which elements we'd prefer to just leave behind? Obviously not without just ignoring the darkness, but, is it something that you feel could be left behind?
I don't know. Does it matter what I feel? Like, people are going to do whatever they are doing. I don't know if it's up to me to give advice on this. I would say that I am tolerant towards expansion and plurality and diversity. And I'm not an orthodox and I'm not a purist. I don't think there is just one way to drink ayahuasca, and I don't think that we have to search for this essence of a tradition and this primordial correct way of using ayahuasca. And I think that if we look to it historically, we see that it's very, as I said, non-linear, non-homogeneous, full of back and forths and full of contradictions and full of tensions between tradition and modernization and so forth. On the one side. On the other side, I do think it's interesting to look on how native people use ayahuasca and try to learn something about it. And I think it's a pity when people discard that completely and just, decide that they know already everything. So I think that I would encourage people to looking to those traditions and learning about it, but I don't think that this means copying or imitating or following it strictly. So there's a big range for variation, and there's maybe other ways to incorporate those principles that are more meaningful for us. So in sum, I'm not like an ayahuasca leader who's going to say, yes, there's brujeria and the spirits are attacking me and I can see that. I'm not following that line, but on the other side, if I see this discourse fluffy that doesn't contemplate tension, I think there is something missing. So in sum, I think people have to search for ways that it's meaningful, and I think that what the expansion shows is that culture is doing a great job in that sense. I'm really optimistic about this cultural possibilities. I don't think we are on the verge of a collapse or that everything is going bad and downhill. I think that culture is extremely dynamic, and I observe many cultural and local forms of control. And I just find it incredible how this expansion, like if you go to ayahuasca rituals anywhere in the world, there are rules, there are structures, there's a leadership, there's a community, there's people following certain guidelines. All this happening in an underground environment with a lot of stigmatization, a lot of persecution, a lot of taboo, a lot of prejudice. And however, people are following this, and I think in a fairly orderly way. So, yeah.
Bea, you've come a long way. You only arrived yesterday. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us.